The history and fortunes of New York City are inextricably linked to the water resources from which it has benefited. We all know the Hudson River, along whose banks the settlement developed. And then there is the Atlantic, of course, from where many of our ancestors crossed over. But there's another small waterway connected to the Hudson that has also played a fundamental role in the city's development, yet it's widely overlooked. I'm referring to the Gowanus Canal. Located in the borough of Brooklyn, this waterway connects the upper New York Bay, bordering neighborhoods like Red Hook, Carroll Gardens, and Gowanus. There are 7 bridges crossing the canal from north to south and 5 from east to west. And as you might imagine, several important industries have developed along its banks, making the canal a vital location to the historic development of the city. These days, however, the area looks decrepit, run down, and suffers a high pollution rate, making the Gowanus Canal a shocking showcase of urban decay. But how did this once vital waterway end up as a monument to nothing? Stay tuned to find out, as today we discover the history of New York's Gowanus Canal. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. The Gowanus neighborhood was originally surrounded by Gowanus Creek, a saltwater marsh with several navigable creeks and large green areas that was home to a variety of animals. The area was therefore sparsely populated, except for small groups of Indians, at least until the first half of the 17th century. During the Dutch occupation, between 1630 and 1644, the government issued several land patents throughout the area, now known as Brooklyn, to allow the establishment of settlements. Then, in 1636, the leading citizens of New Netherlands purchased the area around Gowanus Bay, and in 1639, they cleared the less marshy land for tobacco plantations. The name Gowanus was given during these years in honor of the chief of the Lenape tribe who lived in the area and cultivated some parts of the shore. In 1645, the first watermills appeared, built by some former members of the Dutch West India Company, with the first mill being located just north of Union Street. A second mill, Denton's Mill, also known as the Yellow Mill, was built on Denton's Mill Pond after permission was granted to dredge from the stream to Mill Pond. However, an important moment unfolded in May of 1664 when several other Brooklyn residents petitioned for the regulation and dredging of the canals to ultimately provide water for the other mills that were built or were under construction. In the 1700s, a settler named Nicholas Vetch built what is now known as the Old Stone House, a testament to the growing population that occupied the area over the years. It was an important dwelling used during the Battle of Long Island between the American colonialists and the British Army in 1776. The building we see today is a 1933 reconstruction. Anyhow, in the early 18th century, the area was used by some Dutch settlers to harvest large oysters, which soon became an important raw material for export to the mother country. You see, the nearly 6-foot tides of the Gowanus Bay pushed brackish water into the bay, creating an environment in which large shellfish thrived. And other than that, the area was more or less uneventful. Between 1664 and 1674, the city changed hands several times between English and Dutch rule, and somewhat critically, in 1674, the area of New Orange, as it was again renamed by the Dutch, passed definitively into English hands. But there were no major changes in the canal's area until the second half of the 18th century, when the entire area was transformed after the American War of Independence. In 1774, the New York City government initiated a series of procedures to merge the various waterways into one large stream, to facilitate water maintenance and, above all, to impose more precise taxation on those who used the neighboring land. By the mid-19th century, Brooklyn was growing rapidly and was the third most populated area in the United States. The creek and surrounding farmland were now part of an urban agglomeration of villages along the banks of the creek. The same river and marshland provided both transportation and an informal sewage system for the growing city. Wealthier residences tended to live inland, in the hills to avoid the smells and inconveniences of this type of area. Industries that needed water for processing, transport, and waste disposal moved to these sites along the coast. As the local population grew and the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century came into Brooklyn, the need for larger shipping and docking facilities also started to be noticed. Former Colonel Daniel Richards, a successful businessman, advocated for the construction of an additional canal to serve existing inland industries and the draining of surrounding marshes to reclaim the land and increase property values. And so in 1849, by order of the New York legislature, Gowanus Creek was deepened for use as a 1.5-mile or 2.4-kilometer commercial waterway connecting to Upper New York Bay. The dredging of the creek was completed in 1860. A few years later, another project was proposed to regulate the various creeks into a single channel. The work was completed in 1869, financed partly by direct taxes levied on Brooklyn residents and partly by state funds. And this is where the modern history of the Gowanus Canal actually begins. In a very short time, an important industrial sector developed around the canal. There were all kinds of activities, such as stone and coal works, flour mills, cement and gas plants, tanneries, paint, ink, and soap factories, machine shops, chemical plants, and sulfur producers. And although financially speaking, this was a blessing for Brooklyn, there was a downside. You see, all of these industries emitted significant amounts of pollution into the water and air. But then things got even worse. By 1869, coal processing was a dominant industry as well. By the end of the 19th century, there were 22 coal works along this canal alone. And let's just say they had no concern for the environment. You see, these plants used large amounts of water to convert coal into coke, liquids, and gas, with the coal itself being used for heating, lighting, and powering factories, whereas coke, on the other hand, was made to use steel. And as longtime viewers of this channel know, that steel was used to make skyscrapers like the late Singer Tower. Unfortunately, wastewater and coal tar were discharged directly into the waterway. Other businesses also used the canal to dump waste. For example, slaughterhouses in Brooklyn dumped blood and animal carcasses into the canal. At the time, there was no system for cleaning the waterway. The opening at the southern end alone allowed a limited exchange of water thanks to the tides of the bay. The positive effects of these tides soon failed due to the construction of wooden dikes to protect the settlement and New York Harbor. Within a few years, the water had reached an extremely high level of pollution, described as purple-red in color and emitting a nauseating odor. Its sticky consistency led to it being renamed black mayonnaise. So in 1889, it was decided that the canal and its waters needed to be cleaned up, and a special commission was established. The first step in improving the pollution of the canal was the construction of the Bond Street sewer in 1890, which carried sewage from the harbor. The system proved inadequate, and hence an additional sewer was built between Mercy Avenue and Prosper Heights. But it also proved inadequate for the area's waste, which continued to be dumped into the canal. And all the while, industrialization continued to grow rapidly. In fact, according to some sources, as many as 700 new buildings were constructed each year in the early decades of the 20th century. All the sewage from these new buildings flowed directly downstream into the Gowanus. And so ultimately, in 1910, it became necessary to build a tunnel for water exchange and purification. The pumping station was built on Butler Street and opened in June of 1911. This solution, too, proved ineffective. Although the pollution rate had improved slightly, the water in the canal was still not adequately cleaned. The clean water tunnel suffered numerous technical problems, mainly due to the corrosive salt water from the Gowanus River. Finally, decades later, things came to a head at the end of the 1960s, when a series of accidents put the sewer out of use, and for several years, in part due to the bankruptcy of the New York City government, the area was essentially abandoned. And I need to emphasize here that this transformation into dereliction was really unprecedented, as for much of the 20th century, 6 million tons of goods passed through this canal each year, making it one of the busiest canals in the United States. Throughout the 1960s, industry had moved to other parts of the city, and shipping traffic now passed through the Verrazanos Narrows area. Gowanus essentially became a derelict open-air dump, and remained so for almost 3 decades. By the 1980s, the large space left by the industrial warehouses had attracted new businesses, such as art and architecture studios, music venues, bars, and gyms. Even so, the area had a long way to go, as by the early 1990s, there were still only 24,000 residents along the banks. Further damage was caused in 1984 with the closure of the Carroll Street Bridge, one of the main local access points. It was only reopened in 1989 for the 100th anniversary. By 1993, only one company was actively using the canal for shipping. The few remaining barges carried mainly fuel oil, sand, gravel, and scrap metal for export.
The area was absolutely derelict, and by the end of the 1990s, pressure was mounting for redevelopment.
Between 1999 and 2000, Congresswoman Joan Millman advocated several $100,000 to the Gowanus Canal Community Development Corporation. This was done to develop solutions and projects for the redevelopment of the area and the canal. Governor George E. Pataki provided an additional $270,000 in 2001 to create a revitalization plan. In 2002, $100,000 in capital funding was also allocated to implement a pilot project on the waterfront. Then, in 2003, Congresswoman Nadia Velasquez allocated a further $225,000 to create a comprehensive community plan. All of these funds and projects led to a series of major works, and ultimately, they resulted in a breakthrough. You see, in 2003, the area immediately east of the Gowanus neighborhood was rezoned for high-density residential use with a strong commercial component. This was followed by another breakthrough in 2009, when the New York City government granted a zoning change to the developer, Toll Brothers Incorporated. This allowed for the construction of a 480-unit, 12-story residential project, the first permitted along the waterway. Around this time, the city also reserved land for a medium-scale development of 3,200 homes. 25 blocks were allocated for 60 sites, which were expected to generate a total in $500 million a year in tax revenue. And just when things were headed in the right direction, there was a major setback. The Toll Brothers abandoned the project in 2010 after the Gowanus Canal was declared a Superfund site, a status that absolutely scared away any potential residents, but also allowed faster access to funding of new projects to clean up the canal. And given how vile this waterway was, it was a good decision. In June of 2017, the Gowanus Canal Conservancy began the process of designing a redevelopment plan for the area. By the end of that year, progress was concentrated around the northern half of the canal, which was successfully redeveloped in a very short period. With the new master plan for the area in 2019, several developers had purchased abandoned or unused sites along the waterway. And it's here that we need to point out that despite these changes and the decreasing pollution in the water, this is still one of the dirtiest and most polluted areas in America, as there's really been no long-term program of water quality monitoring due to the funding issues. The canal contains high levels of pathogens, many of which are harmful to humans.
A 1974 report by microbiologists at New York City's Community College found that the water contained typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and tuberculosis.
In addition, a 2003 report of the New York Harbor found that the Gowanus Canal had the highest level of pathogens of any location in the entire harbor. In 2009, a local environmental group called River Keepers tested the canal waters immediately after heavy rains and sewer flooding. The results were putrid. Enterococci were found at levels of 17,329 cells per 100 milliliters, and anything above 104 cells per 100 milliliters is considered dangerous. Enterococci are considered an indicator of other possible pathogens. Things were not improved much. In 2013, fecal matter was still present in the water of the Gowanus at levels of parts per 100. A more common measure for waterways would be parts per million. The contamination of the Gowanus Canal also extended into the Gowanus Creek at the mouth of the canal. In 1982, the USACE published the results of a report on navigation in the creek. Even back then, the report found non-existent oxygen levels, high concentrations of fecal coliforms, and significant concentrations of oil and grease. But there was also an interesting observation. As the canal indeed is toxic to humans, it may harbor previously unidentified species of organisms. In 2008, there were reports of the presence of white clouds of biofilm floating above the mud at the bottom of the canal. Investigations suggested that the white stuff was a cooperative mixture of bacteria, protozoa, chemicals, and other substances. The parts of the mixture worked together to find food, while the biological components exchanged genes and excreted materials that acted as an antibiotic to protect themselves from the toxins in the water. Also analyzed in 2014 was the so-called black mayonnaise, a deadly mix of oil, coal, pesticides, rotting debris, raw sewage, and chemicals that, as we have seen, have been present in the canal since the 19th century. The measurements also indicated the amount of oxygen present, leading researchers to conclude that as far back as the end of the First World War, this waterway was insufficient for life to multiply.
All these studies of bacteria and pollution in the Gowanus have had very important and practical implications.
For example, bioengineers have studied the behavior of certain bacteria in the black mayo and were amazed to find that they somehow survived the breakdown of toxic components. These discoveries have shed new light on studies to use microorganisms in the reduction of water pollution around the world. Other studies have focused on Staphylococcus, which is also resistant to certain substances in the canal. And this analysis of the bacterium has provided a better understanding of the behavior of organisms in developing resistance to antibiotics.
And with that in mind, I'd like to point out that despite its fearsome reputation, the Gowanus has actually found its way into New York City pop culture lore.
In 2014, an issue of the comic book series Tales of the Night Watchman published a title called It Came from the Gowanus Canal. This issue featured a story about a toxic sludge monster residing in the canal, seeking revenge on a gangster who had previously dumped bodies there. Then, in 2015, the publisher also collaborated with the Gowanus Souvenir Shop to produce a fake movie poster based on the book. In 2017, a sequel of the comic was produced called It Came from the Gowanus Canal again, and in this sequel, the monster returns to take revenge on the criminals responsible for the boy's death, but the Night Watchman must protect one of the killers to stop the monster. Then, in 2015, Gothamist, a website dedicated to New York City, published a video of a fisherman claiming to have just caught a three-eyed catfish in the canal. Although the story was subsequently published by several media outlets, experts expressed skepticism about the fish's story. A New York Times article suggested that the three-eyed catfish was a hoax perpetrated by an artist. Finally, the famous daily radio show and podcast, The Majority Report, which broadcasts from Brooklyn, refers to the canal at the beginning of each show, stating, quote, "Broadcasting live from the industrial devastated Gowanus Canal in America's heartland, Brooklyn, New York." In conclusion, the history of New York's Gowanus Canal is a microcosm of challenges, transformations, and hopes for the future. From a time when it was a crystal clear river and a vital element of the local community, to its transformation into a polluted and neglected waterway, the Gowanus embodies the complexity of human relationships with the environment. In recent decades, however, redevelopment and restoration efforts have shown that there is hope for its recovery, and that significant progress is being made to clean up and restore this important historical and environmental site.
A notion that perhaps brings us full circle. But if you thought that episode was interesting, don't miss our live show, The Archive, where I interview one of the sources that inspired not only this story, but many topics on its history. Otherwise, I thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.